Hi everyone, it's Grandmaster Feingold here with our video series, Every Opening Trap to Crush Your Opponents. And this is going to be a fun video because it's disasters on the E-file. And the reason there's more disasters on the E-file than the D-file is the E-file is where the kings start. So you can get in a lot of trouble if there's an open file on the E-file and your king is still there. So let's look at some examples. One of them is sort of a beginner's trap, and the other two are from Grandmaster games. So even Grandmasters, and each game features a world champion. So man, chess is hard. Okay, so the three games we're going to look at start E4, E5. And we're going to start with the Petroff. That's knight F3, knight F6. And most beginners, not all of them, they learn this trap pretty early, either by somebody teaching them or falling into it. After knight takes E5, most people that I teach chess to who've never seen this are surprised that black isn't supposed to take on E4. White took on E5. Why can't black take on E4? Now, you can take on E4, but I only recommend it if you're playing me, because I want to have white in that position. Okay, so knight takes E4 is a known mistake. And black has a very bad position after queen E2 because we're going to have disasters on the E-file. And most beginners don't notice the disaster coming, so they just move their knight back to F6, which is an even bigger mistake than taking on E4. Now, white has more than one way to win, but the best way is knight to C6 check. You're attacking the queen and you're attacking the king. It's a discovered check. And the only move that seems to save the queen and the king is queen E7, but that's also defended by the knight. So this happens a lot in scholastic chess when the players are beginners. They lose their queen very early. And usually that's because white knows the trick and black doesn't. And knight F6 is a really bad move because even if this move didn't win, knight G6 check would also win because the rook is attacked and the king is attacked. So in this position, there are some games where people try to not lose right away. Queen E7, D6, and they're hoping that white has a disaster on the E-file by moving his knight away and losing the queen, but that's silly. And after D4, probably the best black can do is just be down a pawn. For example, if you trade here, which isn't black's best, then black's just down a pawn. Okay. So there's more than one kind of disaster. Now, a disaster that actually happened in a Grandmaster game, I have a personal story about it, is the game Zapata Anand from 1988 in Switzerland. And in that game, they played the main line. So Anand played D6, which is the main move in the Petroff. And now, after knight takes E4, queen E2 does not win material, because we can play queen E7, defending our knight, avoiding the disaster. And in this position, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago and more, almost everybody played D4. That was almost every game. In the last 30 years, there's a more common move now, knight C3. And when this game was played in 1988, knight C3 was a very young move. It had been played by grandmasters for maybe a year and a half, and D4 was still more popular. And Anand claims that he didn't blunder now because of a previous game where black blundered and white didn't take advantage of it. But it's not clear. Maybe he saw that game, thought it was good for black, and didn't analyze it properly. Grandmasters today always play knight takes knight, and also possible is knight back to F6. But knight takes knight's more common. Knight takes C3. And Anand made a terrible blunder here, bishop F5. Now remember, when somebody's the world champion, they're not always the world champion. They weren't born world champion. This was in 1988. Anand was 18 years old. So he was like 25, 50 FIDE. He wasn't the world champion. And that move actually loses immediately because white plays queen E2. And this is a disaster on the E-file. Now, there's two funny things about this position. Actually, there's three. Zapata, the Colombian grandmaster who had white, he actually lives in Atlanta now near me. He's been to our chess club several times. I didn't see that happening. And when Anand lost this game, 5 or 6 months later, he was staying in my apartment in Brussels, Belgium for a week. And of course, I had to tease him because it was, it happened recently. The third funny thing to happen, I was in St. Louis at the St. Louis Chess Club around 2010. And this position occurred again. White was rated 2000, black was rated 1900. And white didn't play queen e2 winning. White played bishop e2, which isn't winning. Okay, now why is queen e2 winning? There's 2 reasons. We're attacking the knight. It's attacked twice and defended once. And if you defend the knight with some normal move like d5, the knight is still pinned. So d3 will win the knight because the knight can't move. It's pinned to the king. That's the disaster on the e file. So the only move that makes any sense, defending your knight and stopping the e file disaster, is queen e7. And Anand resigned instead of playing queen e7. And when I show this to students, a lot of them incorrectly think it was because of queen b5 check attacking the king and the bishop. But this actually will set up white for a disaster on the e file. And after c6 or bishop d7, black is fine. If you take the free bishop, then knight g3 check wins your queen. Now, white falls into the disaster on the e file. So it's actually better for white to play knight to d5. Now, unfortunately, the queen cannot remain on the e file. The queen's attacked, you have to move it. If queen e5, the knight takes it. If queen e6, there's a family fork. So black can't do that. And if black moves the queen to one of the safe squares, let's say d8, then the knight's pinned again, so d3 wins a piece. So actually, bishop f5 is a blunder that loses a piece. Now, what a lot of people do, I would say at least half, when grandmasters blunder really early, they play on and on and on. They get to move 25, 30, 35, and then they resign. That way, people think they lost a 30-move game, and nobody cares. If somebody loses a game in 4, 5, 6, 7 moves, everybody knows about it. So Anand didn't care. He just resigned. But he could have played on down a piece until move 30 or 35, and maybe people wouldn't have noticed. Okay, but he was obviously fed up that he blundered a piece. All right. And that's a real big disaster on the e file that happened in a Grandmaster game. Now, here's another Grandmaster game in a different opening. It's the King's Gambit. And this is the game Boris Spassky versus Yasser Seirawan. Boris Spassky, former world champion. This game was played in 1985. And Spassky was the only super Grandmaster who was playing the King's Gambit pretty often, and followed by Judith Polgar, who also played the King's Gambit pretty often. Okay, and Yasser played a very unusual line that I haven't seen before or since. He played knight e7, and his idea is to play knight g6, protecting his f-pawn, and he did. So he played d5 first, attacking the e4 pawn, and then he played knight g6. So black is up a pawn, and black got rid of white's e-pawn, so it looks good for black. I mean, white doesn't have a big center, black's up a pawn. Okay, and here, Spassky played h4 because if white gets to play h5, that kicks the knight back to e7, and that's not what Yasser wants. It doesn't go back here. Then I can take my pawn back. And Yasser must have thought that h4 was a blunder. And then Yasser made a very bad move here, probably close to losing. He played queen e7, thinking, disaster on the e file. What is Spassky doing? Now, psychologically, what should have happened is Yasser should have said, queen e7, that looks completely winning. Why did my opponent play such a bad move as h4? And he probably thought Spassky was going to play queen e2, defending his knight, and then both queens are sort of misplaced, blocking their bishops. And Spassky made an amazing move here. And the engine says white's already close to winning. And it goes from white having a disaster on the e-file to black, because black has a king and a queen on the e-file. That's very dangerous. And Spassky played the amazing move, king f2. I'm not sure if he prepared that or he figured it out over the board. And I don't think Yasser could possibly have seen king f2. It looks so strange. The idea is if you take the knight on e4, I play bishop b5 check. If you play any kind of blocking move, c6, knight c6, knight, then rook e1 pins and wins. Pin the queen and win it. And a much funnier variation, if you have white, is after king d8, getting off of this file, it doesn't matter. You can't move your queen anywhere to safety. Like this looks safe because of checkmate. That's a disaster on e8. So after king f2, he actually can't take the knight on e4. And you may be thinking, well, okay, so, well, the queen is blocking the bishop. You don't want to play queen e2, queen e7 in the opening. If it's blocking your bishop, then you can't get your pieces out. So Yasser decided, well, if I can't castle kingside, I'll castle queenside. So he played bishop to g4, pinning the knight, h5, and then he can't play knight e7 anymore because he played queen e7. So he played knight h4 because the knight's pinned on f3. And Spassky won his pawn back. Yasser tried to safely castle queenside, but it wasn't safe. Takes, queen d3, and the engine says white's completely winning. White's king's actually very safe. This bishop can't get out. This rook can't get out. My queen's coming to a6. The engine says it's over. Now, Yasser played to move 30-35 before he resigned because he lost a lot of material trying not to get mated. But this is already completely winning for white. It's funny how black castled and white didn't, but white's king is safer. So that was actually potentially a disaster on the e-file for either player. Seirawan thought after queen e7 that white made a mistake. Then after king f2, he was like, oh, now my king and queen are lined up on the e-file. And advice I can give you, if you put your queen and king on the e-file, be careful. Because if a rook comes, which was Spassky's intention, it could spell big trouble. I hope you like the disasters on the e-file. This is Grandmaster Ben Feingold. Please leave a comment and watch more videos in our series. I'll see you next time. Bye.